Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. In the United States, a woman still has a constitutionally protected right to an abortion, but the number and type of obstacles put in her way as many states continue to pass severe restrictions on access to abortion, and as our Supreme Court continues to allow those restrictions, are so many and so diverse, from protesters and fake clinics to gag laws, to admitting privileges rules, to states passing heartbeat laws. The path to abortion can be as challenging as was the fight to gain constitutional protection in the first place. To discuss all of these issues and where we are going from here in an election year where abortion is bound to become, again, a centerpiece of our political conversation, is my guest, David Cohen from the Drexel University Law School here in Philadelphia, and the co-author of a brand new book called Obstacle Course: The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America. A really great conversation with Professor Cohen. I know you're going to want to stay tuned for this important episode. You're going to learn so much as I did. A very important conversation. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to start with a few points about abortion. 1 in 4 women in the United States will have an abortion by the age of 45. That's down from roughly 1 in 3, but still a significant number. Also, as of early 2019, 21 states in the country are deemed hostile to abortion, meaning some 43% of all women in this country live in a state whose laws severely restrict access to abortion. And there is an important Supreme Court case coming up in the next few weeks that may be a significant departure from decisions the Supreme Court has taken in the past, now that we have 2 Trump appointees to the Supreme Court. To discuss these issues and more regarding access to abortion is my guest today. In the studio with me, David Cohen, a professor of law at the Drexel University Law School here in Philadelphia. So, David, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You are the author of a just published book, as well as a scholar and researcher in this area of law, and as somebody who's contributed an amicus brief to the case that the Supreme Court is going to hear in a few weeks, which we'll talk about. Your book is called Obstacle Course: The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America. So I want to talk about that as well, of course. Maybe we could start, if you would give us a little background on yourself and how you've come to this issue in terms of your research, your scholarly work, and so on.
So, like you said, I'm a professor at Drexel. I teach constitutional law and related topics, including reproductive rights and justice and sex discrimination in the law. But before I taught, I was a lawyer here in Philadelphia with a nonprofit called the Women's Law Project. And I've actually continued working with them in my time as a professor. I'm on their board, and I still litigate cases with them. And one of the areas that I was working on then, and I still work closely on now, is representing at times all the abortion providers in Pennsylvania in different areas, whether it's navigating the laws that restrict them and guide and require their patients to jump through hoops, or navigating issues related to harassment by protesters, or dealing with the police and trying to help with situations outside of clinics. Mm-hmm. A lot of different legal issues come up that are special to abortion clinics and abortion providers, and I've been doing that work for a couple decades. And it was really out of connection to that community and working on those issues that I decided to write this book with my co-author, Carol Jaffe, who's a sociologist out in California, to look at what the book does is really look at the different obstacles that a person faces from the moment she finds out she's pregnant to getting the actual abortion procedure, every sort of step along the way, how law tries to interfere with a person's autonomy in making that decision and carrying out that decision.
to their autonomy and their legal and still constitutional right.
Still constitutional right, as of now.
Right. Well, so that's maybe an interesting place to start as an overview. Roe versus Wade was decided by the Supreme Court in 1973. Here we are, the early part of 2020. We're about to get swept up in post-impeachment election primary season. We know that a lot of states, this was in the news a good bit last year, are passing even more highly restrictive access to abortion laws in states like Georgia and Kentucky and Missouri. How hard is it for a woman to get an abortion in the United States today?
It really depends on where they live and their access to resources. In some parts of the country, urban areas, liberal areas, where there's a high density of medical professionals who support abortion and provide abortion, it's hard for some people, but it's easier to access. There are many clinics to choose from. You don't have to travel that far. And insurance companies will support your decision. Even Medicaid will support the decision for indigent women. But for women who live in states where there's a small number of clinics, some states, there's 6 or 7 states that have one clinic, and they are all states that are very large states geographically, or states that Medicaid does not cover abortion, or private insurance also might not cover abortion. For those people, accessing abortion is really difficult. And this is in a world where we still have Roe v. Wade. So people have a legal right to get an abortion. The state can't say no. That's still the basic constitutional law. But what states have done is put so many obstacles in the path of a woman choosing to have an abortion that it's really difficult for some women. And what I think our book shows is the extent of those obstacles, but also sort of the flip side of that, which is just how determined people are when they face a pregnancy that they either don't want or they did want but they can't have anymore, and how determined they are to actually jump through all these hoops and alter their lives in significant ways just to make this happen. Because you're right, the numbers are down from 1 in 3 women to 1 in 4 women have an abortion by the time they're 45. But the pregnancy rate is also lower because of contraception being more effective. So it's not that there are more people deciding who are pregnant to against abortion. It's just that the numbers show that people are it's a similar rate in terms of people who are getting pregnant who choose to have an abortion. So people are still navigating these obstacles, but at great burdens to themselves, their families, and other aspects of their lives, and also because abortion providers have figured out how to navigate these difficult laws and still provide excellent care.
Yeah. Well, and I know in the book you approach this issue of access, again, to a still constitutional right to this kind of health care from the perspective of the women who are seeking abortion and the kinds of obstacles they can face. And I'm seeing that there are roughly 3 big buckets that we could talk about. One is at the highest level, and I want to perhaps start there, which is the Supreme Court case that's coming up. I think people need to know about it and know how significant it has the potential for being and why. And then there are varying state laws that we've been hearing about and talking about that are attempting to perhaps take advantage of changes in the Supreme Court and generate cases that will work their way up to the High Court by having state legislatures pass more highly restrictive abortion laws than we've ever seen before. And then there are all these other ways in which women face obstacles, everything from access to coverage, as you were suggesting, to logistical transportation issues, given the shrinking in the number of clinics that would provide this service. So I want to kind of touch on all of those in different ways, because I think those really help create a picture of just how difficult it is. And hopefully people think that that's not a good thing.
Right.
We should be finding ways to make safe and legal abortion more available and more accessible. But maybe we could start with the Supreme Court case. You and I were chatting about it a little bit, and I know that you wrote an amicus brief, and you can tell us about that too. But what is this case, and why is it important? How does this case have the potential to pretty dramatically change women's access to abortion?
The case is called June Medical versus Gee. It's out of Louisiana, and the Supreme Court is going to hear oral argument on the case on March 4th, which is a Wednesday. The case is incredibly significant, not necessarily because the legal issue in particular, and I'll explain it in a second, but because it's the first abortion case to be heard by the court since President Trump appointed Justice Gorsuch to replace Justice Scalia. That doesn't really change the court that much, or we don't think it will change the court that much because it's swapping out conservatives. But replacing Justice Kennedy, who was conservative but a middle-of-the-road conservative, and he was also a supporter of Roe v. Wade, the basic right to abortion,
right,
with Justice Kavanaugh. Justice Kavanaugh, who went through the highly contentious confirmation hearings a year and a few months ago, this will be his first abortion case. He had an abortion case when he was a D.C. Circuit judge, where this was the very high-profile case involving the minor in Texas who was in custody for crossing the border as an unaccompanied minor, and she wanted an abortion, and the D.C. Circuit finally allowed her to have the abortion. Judge Kavanaugh, when he was on the D.C. Circuit, dissented and said, well, she should try a little harder before we intervene. She should possibly get another sponsor. He basically said, look, it's been hard enough for her, but let's make it even a little harder, and maybe we'll hear from her in a month or two. So he was willing to delay her care, asking her to jump through all these hoops as an unaccompanied minor in another country being held. I mean, it was kind of a crazy opinion to think that. But that's the only evidence we have, other than that he was appointed by a Republican president, supported by the Federalist Society. So the concern here is that Justice Kavanaugh could join with the other 4 Republican conservatives on the Supreme Court and really change abortion law in this country. The case in particular deals with a law out of Louisiana which requires abortion doctors to get what are called admitting privileges. They have to have a contractual relationship with a local hospital that if a patient that they are caring for needs emergency care, they will go to that hospital. Now, stated that way, it sounds like, well, of course we want our doctors to be affiliated with hospitals. That's a good thing. But there's a few problems with that. One, that abortion doctors tend not to send patients to hospitals because it's a very safe form of outpatient care. And usually these contractual relationships require doctors to send a certain number of patients to a hospital every year, but abortion doctors just don't do that because the care is so safe. Second, it gives sort of a third party a veto over abortion care because the hospital gets to say who's going to provide abortion care in the state of Louisiana. And as you can imagine, it's a conservative, deeply red state, a lot of Catholic hospitals. So they can say no to the doctor, even if the doctor provides excellent care, because they don't like abortion.
Right. It's not like there's an appeal of the denial of hospital privileges.
There isn't.
You don't have a right to that. The hospital can just say, no, we don't want to.
Right. We don't want to associate with you, and they're allowed to do that. So the reality is that what happens with this law is that doctors are not able to perform abortions in Louisiana, and clinics shut down. And in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court, when Kennedy was on the court, heard a very similar case out of Texas involving admitting privileges. And the court found that the admitting privileges law in Texas was unconstitutional. It was a 5-3 decision. So that was a real big win for abortion rights, but that was with Justice Kennedy on the court. Yeah. So what's happened since then is the Louisiana case was heard by the Fifth Circuit, which is the appeals court, the federal appeals court that covers Louisiana and Texas. And the Fifth Circuit said, Louisiana is different than Texas. We're bound by the U.S. Supreme Court decision, but Louisiana is different because the geography is different, the number of clinics are different. Maybe these doctors can get admitting privileges. And even if we go down to 1 or 2 clinics in Louisiana, there are currently 5. They can go to Texas or Mississippi or
Yeah.
other places, and it's just not as big a state. In Texas, if there's only 7 or 8 clinics, it's such a huge state, that'll be really troublesome. But in Louisiana, it's a smaller state.
Well, I was wondering if geography is also a factor, though, in that I imagine, if you're going to have admitting privileges to a hospital, I think usually you have to be within a certain range of that hospital. You're not going to have admitting privileges at a hospital 100 miles away, for example.
Right. It has to be a local hospital.
Right.
Which is also kind of strange because abortion patients often are traveling hundreds of miles, so they can go to a clinic, get the procedure, and say if they develop bleeding a couple days later, now they're home, which is nowhere near the clinic, nowhere near the hospital. So it doesn't make sense that the doctor has to be affiliated with a local hospital. But that's what Louisiana did. Mm-hmm. The Fifth Circuit said it's okay. The Supreme Court took the case. And in theory, that's a good thing because we want the Fifth Circuit decision to be reversed. But with this Supreme Court, it's scary.
Well, and it's curious that the Supreme Court accepted the case, too, given that they arguably had decided a very similar case 3 years ago. I mean, does that suggest at least what you can read between the lines here, that they may well have an interest in changing course from that Texas case just decided?
Yes, because they could have summarily reversed the Fifth Circuit. They could have remanded the case and said to the Fifth Circuit, we're remanding this case because you didn't follow Whole Woman's Health, the 2016 case. But instead they took the case. They're going to hear it. And I think most observers are expecting the court to allow Louisiana to have this law. And there are a lot of different ways the court could do this. It could say Louisiana is different than Texas. The 2016 case stays on the books, but Louisiana is different. It could go further and overturn the 2016 case, the Texas case, and say we just don't think admitting privileges are ever a constitutional problem. The court could go even further and say that the 1992 case out of Philadelphia, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which set the standard for how to review abortion restrictions, that we're going to reevaluate that standard. Or the court could even go further, and this
theoretically, they could overturn Roe v. Wade.
Exactly, they could overturn Roe v. Wade, and I think there's a lot of attention, rightfully so, being placed on that possibility. Personally, I don't think that's what's going to happen with this case. I don't think Chief Justice Roberts wants the first Kavanaugh abortion case to overturn Roe. That would look too political, I think. I've certainly been wrong with my predictions before, but I think that they'll wait. If that's what they want to do, I think they'll wait.
Well, many have said that overturning Roe v. Wade itself is one way to go. A different way to go that doesn't look quite so overtly controversial is to just hack away at Roe versus Wade one case at a time until effectively you've overruled Roe versus Wade.
Exactly. And that's, a lot of what our book shows, which is how even in a world where Roe is the law, there are all these ways that states try to restrict abortion. And that's what our book goes through. And so the result of this case could be that Roe survives, but that the Supreme Court is going to allow even more restrictions on abortion. I think that's the most likely outcome here. So this is a really important case. It's going to give us a lot of information about what to expect in the coming years with this 5-4 conservative majority around abortion.
Well, let me segue from that point then to some of the ways in which varying states beyond this admitting privilege restriction have passed laws and and created ways that erect barriers to access to abortion. Because I imagine that even if the Supreme Court in this admitting privileges case takes the more narrow approach, even if it takes the narrowest approach that you just described and just rules on the Louisiana law, that's going to send a signal to other states and embolden those states and perhaps give us some indication of how the Supreme Court is going to handle these other cases that are going to be working their way up through the appeals courts.
Yeah, I mean, the result of a Supreme Court decision around abortion is that there are states that will copy what the state has done that is now given its approval in the Supreme Court, and then there are other states that will take it as a signal to push the limits. and try new things to restrict in new ways. So if the Louisiana admitting privileges law is approved by the Supreme Court, we will see other states enact similar admitting privileges laws. And so that will be damaging in the same way it's damaging in Louisiana and Texas. But they will also then press on and say, okay, well, we've gotten the blessing for that, so let's push even further and let's restrict in other ways. Mm-hmm. And so you're absolutely right that it will be taken both as a literal approval of this type of restriction, but it will also be taken as a signal to go even further and impose all sorts of obstacles in the path of someone choosing to have an abortion.
And what are the obstacles as passed by state legislatures that you think are the most worrisome? It would be these heartbeat laws that we saw a lot of attention to in the last year or so.
Yeah, so I mean, those are the most extreme. I mean, the laws that were passed in states like Alabama, Georgia, Ohio last year would ban abortion at around 6 weeks. A lot of people don't even know they're pregnant at that point in time, and if they do, they've just found out and they're still making a decision and they still have to get to a clinic. So it's virtually a ban on abortion. I mean, that will only survive if the Supreme Court overturns Roe, that kind of restriction, which is why every court that has looked at those 6-week bans has found them unconstitutional so far. But short of that kind of...
Because the Roe framework is still viability, which, depending, I guess, on what health center...
24 weeks, yeah. So, the Roe framework still says that states have to have abortion legal through viability. Yeah. So that is a bare minimum, and courts, even courts that disagree with Roe, the lower courts, they have to follow it. So until the Supreme Court overturns Roe, we shouldn't see these 6-week bans ever take effect. Mm-hmm. But what we do see are all sorts of other restrictions that interfere with the woman's free exercise of her choice. And it starts at the moment that she finds out she's pregnant and tries to make a decision. There are states that refuse to allow publicly funded hospitals or clinics to refer or counsel about abortion. So if you go to your physician or nurse practitioner, whoever it is you see for medical care, and you say, I'm interested, I'm not sure what I want to do with this pregnancy, they can't talk to you about abortion. Or if you do say, I want to end this pregnancy, they can't give you a referral to the local abortion clinic. They have to say, I can't talk to you about that. And that's been made even worse by the gag rule imposed by the Trump administration for Title X, which is federally funded health centers.
How are those not challengeable under the First Amendment? I mean, I guess I've never thought of it in quite that way, but...
Yeah, there's a precedent from the Supreme Court in the early 90s where a similar restriction from the Reagan-Bush years was challenged, and the Supreme Court said it's not a First Amendment violation because the doctors can choose not to take federal funds. So if you want the federal funds, you are accepting this restriction on your speech, so that it's not a direct restriction. And that restriction never went into place during the Reagan-Bush years because it was stuck in litigation, and then Clinton reversed it. But Trump put it back in place, and it is now in effect because the courts have allowed it to go into effect. There's still an appeal working its way through, but the courts have allowed it to go into effect, which is why Planned Parenthood has pulled out of the Title X program.
Yeah.
So, that kind of restriction just very early on in the process. But from there, finding a clinic can be very difficult because of things like admitting privileges, but also what are called TRAP laws, which are targeted regulations of abortion providers, TRAP. They require these outpatient centers to meet the requirements of pretty much a hospital operating room in order to provide an abortion. Now, first trimester abortions and most second trimester abortions are pretty straightforward, fast procedures that you don't need that big of a room. You just need a table for the patient. It needs to be a medical room, certainly, but it doesn't need to be an operating room. And so
we have so-called ambulatory surgical centers sprouting up everywhere to handle less complicated surgeries than would be done in a hospital.
Right, but even that is beyond what's needed for an abortion clinic. It's more like just an outpatient procedure at a dermatologist or some other medical office. And what those requirements do is they impose these huge financial burdens on clinics, which means more shut down, and it makes it harder for people to access. But I think some of the things that are the most burdensome are waiting periods, where states require patients to wait 24, 48, 72 hours, sometimes even more, from their initial visit to getting the procedure. Now, some people react to those and say, well, I wait to see my doctor too. I call up my doctor and they say they don't have an appointment in 2 months or 3 months. Right. Or I wait for a medical test, or I wait from the initial appointment until when they have an opening for whatever procedure is needed. But that's because the medical professional has no openings. Abortion clinics are really excellent masters of efficiency. They usually have openings within a few days because of the time sensitivity of the procedure. So it's not that the clinic is saying, because of our backload, we can't see you. It's the state saying, on top of when the clinic is available to see you, you have to wait these extra time, which just means more time off work for patients, more childcare, extra travel. And again, for patients who have resources, not that, I mean, it's cumbersome, but it's not that big a deal. But for 75% of abortion patients that are at near the poverty level or below it, and that's the stats about who gets abortions in this country, this can be really difficult, because to travel requires money, to get childcare requires money, and if you are already living on the edge in terms of finances, this extra visit is really burdensome.
Well, also I'm thinking too, to get a test or to get in to see a doctor and to be told the first appointment's 2 months from now. I mean, that if it's a life-threatening situation, you're going to find some way to get seen sooner. And if it's not, you say, fine, it takes 2 months, no problem. But 2 months for a woman who's pregnant makes a huge difference, right, in so many different ways. I mean, I would think the rate of medical complications from the pregnancy goes up the longer the pregnancy is happening. Emotional, psychological issues in terms of how difficult the decision is to get an abortion become more complex. As a woman starts showing the pregnancy more, there's risk of discrimination in the workplace because of pregnancy. We might like to think that isn't a problem, but it is a problem, and for a lot of women in a lot of parts of our economy. So it's a very consequential thing to have that waiting period.
Yeah, I mean, abortion is a very safe procedure, but with every week of pregnancy, it gets a little more complicated. The procedure changes, so people at 10 weeks or earlier, you can have a medical procedure, which involves just taking pills. After that, you can't. The procedure sometimes takes longer, and it's more expensive. Mm-hmm. And cost becomes a real issue, especially in the states, and Pennsylvania is one of them. And there are 33 states right now that prohibit the Medicaid program from covering abortion. And again, getting back to the poverty stats, with the majority of abortion patients living in poverty or close to it as defined by the federal government, the fact that Medicaid doesn't cover means that for a large number of women, it's really difficult to pay for abortion. And of course, with the connection between poverty and race in this country, there's a disproportionate impact on women of color. Right. So this all works to, as I said to start, for women with means, these hurdles are burdensome, but they are not that difficult to overcome. For people, when you're dealing with poverty and other difficult aspects of life, these obstacles really become burdensome for them.
Right. Well, and now on the flip side, the one response that we've seen, and you do talk about this in the book too, one response to states that are pursuing more and more restrictive rules and regulations and statutes to limit access, clearly to limit access to abortion. You do have some states that are doing the opposite. States like New York and others. I mean, tell us a little bit about that, because it does make you wonder if at some point whether Roe versus Wade is overruled in fact, or whether it's just so gutted from the inside out that it's as if it isn't there at all, that we are going to be back in a world where access to abortion is going to be a function of what state you live in.
Yeah, it's really a function of your zip code. It's there are states, and we've seen a ramp up of this in the past few years, that are looking at the states like Alabama, Ohio, North Dakota, and seeing all the ways that those states are restricting abortion and responding by saying, well, we want to make sure abortion is more easily accessible in our state. We want to remove barriers, or we want to even, beyond just removing barriers, we want to make it easier, affirmatively easier for patients. And so, you've got some of the usual suspects, New York, Illinois, California, Oregon, that have been doing this. But I think the state I like to point to in the past year is Maine, which, when they got a Democratic governor in office from the elections of 2018, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, elections matter. And one of the things that they did, they passed 2 laws around abortion, which radically change abortion in the state of Maine. One, they said Medicaid will cover abortion.
That's huge.
And which is just monumental. And 2, they said that advanced practice clinicians can perform abortions, not just doctors. So that means nurses, midwives, and physician's assistants. And so Maine already was a state, because of how rural it is and how much of the population is concentrated in the southern part and along the coast, but there's still a lot of people who live dispersed in the rest of Maine. Maine was already a state where you could use telemedicine for some medical procedures. And so with Medicaid and advanced practice clinicians and telemedicine, what it means is that abortion has become so much more accessible in Maine.
So I just make sure I understand that when you say telemedicine, in other words, especially for a very early term.
Correct, for medical abortions.
You could be on the phone or FaceTime or however you communicate with a doctor, not necessarily in person, and get a prescription so that you can get the abortion medically.
Right. So the usual form of this takes place, you're at a health center, which is not an abortion clinic, but you do a video call to an abortion clinic or even just a doctor or nurse practitioner's office. They do the counseling, they walk you through, they ask you about your medical history, they, all the things that they would normally ask to make sure that the medicine is safe for you and that this is your decision and this is what you want. The normal informed consent process. And then at the end of that, they push a button, and at the health center where the patient actually is, the medicine appears through a drawer that is locked. And so they can take the pills and have the abortion remote from where the physician is. They have even experimented in Maine with abortion by mail, where after you get the counseling, they will mail the person in an unmarked envelope the pills. I mean, there are ways to really expand access, and there are states that are experimenting with that and advancing changing laws to improve access. So back to your point, we are seeing these states that are drastically reducing abortion access, but these other states that are increasing it, and so it creates this world, even in the world of where Roe is still the law, where there's just a huge differential in the ease of access to a safe, legal medical procedure, depending on where you live. If Roe is overturned, that would still be the case, except the states where it's hard will now be states where it's illegal.
Yep, altogether.
And, right, illegal altogether. So we're going to see a lot of abortion tourism, as the phrase goes, and, not without the connotation of the pleasure that comes from tourism, right?
Yes.
But just the fact
Traveling
that people are going
to
to
a state.
travel
Yeah.
to Illinois in the middle of the country, or New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and California and Oregon on the other coast. So we're going to see a lot of travel. And again, that gets back to patients with means, patients with time, who will be able to access the care, and others who won't.
Well, you've just given me the segue into that third bucket that I wanted to talk about when you talk about travel. You do tell a lot of personal stories of women who have sought an abortion and the different kinds of struggles that they have to go through and the hurdles they have to overcome. They're very powerful stories. And what are some of the takeaways from that you can talk about? Because beyond the kinds of restrictions we've talked about, there are these other ways in which the experience of trying to get an abortion can be so difficult as a function of things that the law has allowed to exist. Like one of the stories that you tell in the book early on talks about these fake clinics that are popping up right next door to actual abortion clinics, and the effect of protesters and some might say harassers, and talk about that a little bit, because those are face-to-face type restrictions, but I would think in any one individual's experience, those can be just as powerful as some of these state laws that we're talking about.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. These are things that, for the most part, the Supreme Court has allowed to happen. There have been various challenges, and I'll explain them in a second, but these are things that the state doesn't require, but that has been allowed to happen. So you touched on two important ones: fake clinics, sometimes called crisis pregnancy centers. Now, put yourself outside the world of abortion and think of going to the dentist or going to a pediatrician with your kid, and that imagine if there was a fake dentist across the street using the same words in the name of the dentist's office, but just a reworked order. So instead of dental care of Philadelphia, it would be Philadelphia Dental Care. Or same with a pediatrician. That's what is almost everywhere with abortion. There are thousands of these fake clinics around the country, and they like to set up near abortion clinics. They like sometimes across the street, sometimes next door, sharing the same parking lot. They use names that are intended to confuse. They have websites that don't make it clear that they don't provide abortion. What these fake clinics are usually religiously affiliated anti-abortion centers that don't have medical professionals on staff. A small number do, but you usually don't, whose goal is to persuade people to not have an abortion.
Incredible.
That's, again, not what they tell people on the website, not when they tell them when they walk in. What they tell them when they walk in is, oh, you're pregnant and you're considering your options, let's talk. And then they use every tool they can, including lies, to try and force someone to not have an abortion. So around one of the common things that happens, and we heard lots of stories of this, some of them have ultrasound machines, and they have non-medical people reading ultrasounds, and they will give the wrong information based on the ultrasound. So a patient who's, say, 20 weeks, they will say you're 26 weeks
too late.
Or a patient who's, say, 14 weeks, they'll say, well, you're 6 weeks or 8 weeks, you have plenty of time to make the decision, so take your time. Either way, I mean, you need to have precise dating from ultrasound to know what your options are and how much time you have to make the decision, because around 24 weeks is when most states start prohibiting abortion. So these clinics, these fake clinics, will lie to patients to intentionally deceive them from having an abortion. There are lots of other tactics, but these are deceptive, intentionally deceptive places that want to stop people from exercising their constitutional right. Some states have tried to regulate these fake clinics, but the Supreme Court, in a decision from a year and a half ago, said that they have First Amendment rights. And those First Amendment rights say that, for instance, the state of California required these fake clinics to say something so minimal: we are not a medically licensed facility, or we are not a licensed medical facility. And for a different group of them, that they had to say, you can get more information about abortion and contraception from the state of California, from our website. That minimal regulation was struck down as unconstitutional, violating the free speech rights of the clinics.
Unbelievable.
So
and I'm looking at Maddie, my producer, and her jaw is on the ground.
I mean, these are common experiences for patients who are deceived into going to these places. Often, you think you're going to the clinic, but you're really going to this fake clinic.
Are these fake clinics nonprofit? Are they getting some benefit of tax exemption?
So even worse, they are nonprofits, and many states fund them from public tax-funded dollars. So Pennsylvania funds them at the tune of $6 or $7 million a year. Texas funds many millions per year. And so these are nonprofits that get the benefits of being nonprofits, and they are often affiliated with religious institutions, so they get tax exemption that way, and then they also get taxpayer dollars.
I don't even know what to say at the moment. That is so disturbing to me.
It is. It's very disturbing, and it's this is they interfere with patients at the point of making a decision because it makes it harder to make a decision when you're confronted with lies and deception. And then it also interferes with patients actually just trying to do the basic thing of finding the clinic, right? Mm-hmm. I think I'm showing up at the clinic and I'm actually showing up at the fake clinic.
Well, and as a constitutional matter, we talked earlier about the so-called gag rule. Yeah. That where the Supreme Court justified overruling the First Amendment rights of a healthcare provider on the grounds that they're receiving federal dollars, and here these fake clinics lying, cheating, and stealing, and preventing someone from exercising their constitutional right. They're getting the benefit of federal dollars in the form of tax exempt status, of receiving federal or state tax dollars. But they have a First Amendment right to do that.
Yeah,
it just seems so hypocritical.
It blew my mind when that decision came out. I, very unhappily joked that the fake clinics have real First Amendment rights and the real doctors have fake First Amendment rights.
So true.
And that's the backwards world we're living in this abortion creates legal nonsense from the Supreme Court sometimes, and this is one of these ways. The other thing that I think fits into this category we're talking about is the way the Supreme Court has allowed protesters to interfere with people's access to abortion clinics. And we're not talking about holding a protest in front of City Hall where you say, I'm opposed to abortion, right? That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about are protesters ranging from a small number to hundreds, sometimes even thousands, outside of a clinic during their operating hours, making it difficult for people to enter the clinic because just large masses of people shouting at patients and their companions as they're going in, calling them murderers, trying to threaten them. People usually know how to walk the line so that they're not saying an explicit threat, but you will go to hell. We know who you are. We know where you live. We know where your kids go to school.
Well, you describe one experience in your book where protesters had taken apart a number of dolls and were throwing doll limbs covered in fake blood at patients as they were trying to get access to a clinic.
Yeah, so that,
and saying, this is what you're going to do to your baby, and your baby's blood's going to be,
Right, handing them doll or fetus dolls, putting dolls in trees and saying, those are the kids that you're killing. Pamphlets that have all sorts of lies about the incorrect medical risks of abortion. Protesters who stand outside of a clinic with a clipboard trying to look all official to check people into the clinic, which you don't have to do. But hey, you're driving into a medical facility, you see someone with a clipboard and they say, can you give us your name and what you're here for today? And you think, oh, that person's checking me in, when it's really a protester who's keeping track of patients coming into a clinic. There are all sorts of these measures taken by people outside of clinics to intimidate patients and the actual workers at the clinics.
Right.
And so, that's what people have to walk through to get their medical care. And again, you go back to other forms of medical care and you just imagine that if someone were, if you had mass protests outside of a dentist's office or a pediatrician's office, how there would be a very different response from the community, a very different response from law enforcement.
Absolutely.
And the medical community too. But it just goes to how much abortion is stigmatized and shamed that we accept, law enforcement accepts this kind of mass protest out that impedes the operation of a medical care facility.
So how did you do I know you did a lot of interviews of women who've been through a variety of the experiences that we've talked about. Just say a word or two about how you approach this book and how it's different from, say, a legal scholarly type work on this topic, because we've talked about this in a very personal way, trying to get at the very human experience that people go through. How did you why did you approach this book that way, and how did you approach it in terms of the preparation and the research?
So the book is based on over 70 interviews with abortion providers, actually. We took the stories of patients from other publicly available sources. There's one of the changes in the past decade or so, which is really wonderful in a lot of ways, is that people who have had abortions are speaking up about their experience and saying, we're going to be silent no longer, and we are going to let people know that there are a lot of people out there who've had abortions, and there are a lot of people out there who are successful in their lives now or have just developed, full lives because they had an abortion early on.
Excuse me.
And to quote another abortion advocate, everyone loves someone who's had an abortion. Because it's that common. And so there's a lot of people speaking up, a lot of people publicly telling their stories, and we use a lot of those stories in the book. What we did originally was talk with abortion providers from every state in the country and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico to hear from them about what it means to provide good patient care amidst these regulations and restrictions. So for them to tell us what their patients have to go through, but also to tell us how they have to restructure their medical care in light of this. But also to hear from people who provide abortions in the states that we were talking about, where it's more accessible, how abortion care can be integrated into otherwise normal medical care, and how much easier that is, how much better it is for a patient. We talked to one physician who told us, I have a patient who comes in and she gets a positive pregnancy test, and I ask her what she wants to do. And she says, you know what? I do not want to have this pregnancy. And she can offer her the pills on the spot that day. That's so different than it is in other parts of the country, where as soon as you find out you have a positive pregnancy test and are thinking about abortion, you get into this whole cycle of restrictions that impede normal medical care.
Well, what I love about the book and what I love about what we're talking about right now is I'm always mindful of where we are in the election cycle. And I guess as a lawyer and someone interested in history and interested in the court, I've always thought that what you thought a presidential candidate would do with the Supreme Court nominee should be a very important part of how you evaluate that candidate overall, whether you can support that candidate, because it is a unique responsibility of the president to appoint to the Supreme Court, and it can have, as we've seen, and as you're suggesting, I think as we're going to continue to see, really profound implications for so many people's lives. So I'm grateful that we're talking about this, because we also in our political culture tend to reduce conversations about topics like this to slogans and headlines, and we clearly need to look beyond that to really appreciate why this is so important and why so many lives are affected. And I think the book is terrific. We'll include a link to the book, which is now out. Obstacle Course, The Everyday Struggle to Get an Abortion in America by David Cohen and your co-author?
Carol Jaffe.
Carol Jaffe from
California. She's San Francisco or Berkeley-based sociologist.
Oh, good.
Associated with University of California at San Francisco.
Okay, my parents met at Berkeley, and I was born in San Francisco. So thank you. Thank you for the book. We'll include a link to the book in the description for the episode, so all you have to do is click on that link and it'll take you to where you can get a copy of the book. We'll also put some info on your bio in that description, David, so you can find out more about you personally.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you're right. This is an election year, and abortion is always a hot topic in an election year. Add on the Supreme Court decision. We're going to have the oral arguments in March and a decision in June. Yeah. We're going to be talking a lot about abortion this year.
Right.
And the hope is, the polls are consistent that a big majority of the country supports Roe v. Wade and supports abortion being legal, and people just have to vote accordingly.
Right. Well, I'm glad we could have the conversation about abortion today with you. David Cohen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.